A frail old man stepped into the cafe, his presence immediately met with disdain. Henry, at 92 years old, looked worn out by life itself. His thin, trembling frame carried the weight of years of hardship. His clothes, ragged and threadbare, barely protected him from the cold wind outside. The shuffle of his near-broken shoes echoed against the cafe's polished floor as he made his way inside, each step as fragile as the man himself. The cafe fell silent for a moment, heads turning. Whispers spread. People exchanged glances filled with quiet judgment, the kind that cut deep. Henry felt it, the sharp sting of being humiliated before he even opened his mouth. His chest tightened as the reality of his situation sank in. He wasn't just old, in their eyes, he was unwanted. His gaze stayed low. He didn't want to see the cold eyes around him, but he knew they were there. He'd felt this before, this sense of invisibility, of being nothing more than an annoyance, a burden to the world. But today, his stomach growled louder than his pride. Reaching the counter, Henry placed a few crumpled dollar bills on the surface, his hands shaking slightly. Just a sandwich," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His hunger was overwhelming, and he hoped, just this once, for a little kindness. The woman behind the counter, Clara, glanced down at the money. Her lips curled into a sneer. "We're not a charity," she said coldly, looking him up and down as if he were beneath her. Her arms crossed over her chest, her posture radiating contempt. "If you don't have enough money, then you don't eat." Humiliated, Henry's heart sank further. The air felt thick with judgment. He could feel the eyes of every customer on him, burning holes into his back. He swallowed the lump forming in his throat, trying to summon what little dignity he had left. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely louder than a breath. "I'm hungry." Clara leaned forward, her voice sharp and filled with scorn. "You think you can come in here and beg? This isn't a homeless shelter, old man. Get out if you can't pay." The cafe erupted in quiet laughter. One customer nearby smirked, shaking his head as if amused by the spectacle. "Can't believe he even thought he could afford anything here," someone muttered. Henry's knees felt weak, his body trembling, not just from hunger but from the sheer weight of shame. His hands still clutched a few pathetic bills, but they felt like nothing now, useless. He wanted to disappear, to vanish from the harsh gazes and cruel laughter. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, the door to the cafe swung open again. A woman entered, her heels clicking sharply on the tiled floor. Dressed in crisp, expensive clothes, her presence commanded attention. The room seemed to shift. All eyes turned to her, and suddenly, Henry wasn't the center of the unwanted attention anymore. Her eyes scanned the room, her brow furrowed slightly as she took in the scene. And then, something caught her eye. She paused, her heart racing. There was something about the old man, something on his wrist. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her gaze fixated on the object. Could it really be? The woman's sharp heels clicked across the floor as she made her way toward the counter. The cafe, which had moments ago been filled with quiet laughter at Henry's expense, now fell silent. Eleanor, a name whispered in the town for her wealth and influence, had arrived. Her eyes, still focused on the old man, scanned him carefully. Then she saw it, the watch on his wrist, gleaming under the cafe's dim lights. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that watch. She froze for a moment, her mind racing, but quickly composed herself. "What's the problem here?" Eleanor's voice cut through the still air, firm yet controlled. She stood tall, her posture commanding attention, and her eyes glinted with an intensity that left no room for argument. Clara stiffened, caught off guard. "This man can't pay," she replied, trying to maintain her usual authority. "We're not a charity." Eleanor turned to Henry, her gaze softening as she saw the desperation in his eyes. His hands, still trembling, clutched a few crumpled bills in defeat. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. The tension in the room rose as she stepped forward, placing a crisp $50 bill on the counter in front of Clara. "This man's meal is on me today," Eleanor said, her tone calm but unyielding. The look in her eyes made it clear that she would not take no for an answer. Henry blinked, his eyes wide with surprise. His voice faltered as he tried to find words. I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need," Eleanor replied gently, her gaze never leaving Clara. The cafe owner hesitated, visibly flustered by the interruption. The sharp contrast between Clara's icy demeanor and Eleanor's quiet strength was palpable. Clara crossed her arms defensively, her pride wounded. "I already said this isn't a place for handouts," she muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. Her voice wavered slightly, though, as the entire cafe watched with bated breath. Eleanor leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with quiet power. "And I said," she paused, her eyes locking onto Clara's, "you'll serve this man. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows how this place treats those in need." The air grew thick with tension. For a moment, Clara didn't move. Her face flushed, and her hands gripped the counter tightly. But she knew better than to challenge Eleanor, whose reputation in the town was untouchable. The whispers in the cafe stopped as everyone waited for what would happen next. Finally, with a frustrated huff, Clara snatched the money from the counter and turned toward the kitchen. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her pride bruised, but her hands tied. "But don't expect this to happen again." Eleanor watched her walk away, then turned back to Henry. The old man stood there, stunned, still clutching his few bills as if they had any value left. Tears welled up in his eyes, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from gratitude, a feeling so rare for him these days that it felt almost foreign. "You didn't have to," Henry murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't deserve." "You deserve to eat like anyone else," Eleanor interrupted softly, her expression warm. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Henry nodded slowly, too overwhelmed to speak. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Let's get you a seat," she said kindly, guiding him toward a nearby table as the cafe staff reluctantly began preparing his meal. Henry sat down slowly at the small corner table Eleanor had led him to. His knees creaked as he lowered himself into the chair, and his tired body seemed to sag with the weight of the day. Relief washed over him, though his heart still raced from the confrontation. His trembling hands rested on the table, still clutching the few crumpled bills, but now they felt unnecessary. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he wouldn't have to count every cent just to afford a meal. Eleanor sat across from him, her presence both comforting and strong. She kept a watchful eye on Clara behind the counter, making sure there would be no further trouble. The cafe had returned to its usual buzz of quiet conversations, but there was still an undercurrent of tension. Whispers filled the room, but now they weren't mocking. Now they were filled with curiosity about the woman who had just stood up for a stranger. Moments later, a waiter arrived reluctantly, setting down a simple sandwich and a small cup of coffee in front of Henry. There was no enthusiasm in his movements, but under Eleanor's firm gaze, he said nothing and left without a word. Henry stared at the sandwich for a long moment. His eyes watered, but he quickly blinked back the tears. It wasn't just the food, it was the kindness. It was the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone had seen him as more than just a burden. He picked up the sandwich with shaking hands and took a slow, deliberate bite. The taste of the bread, the meat, it was simple, but to him, it was a feast. Every bite felt like a small victory, a reminder that he was still here, still deserving of dignity, no matter what others thought. Eleanor watched him, her face softened with empathy. It was clear that this wasn't just about food for Henry. It was about regaining a small piece of his humanity. She smiled faintly, feeling both satisfaction and sorrow at the same time. What kind of world had they become, where a man like Henry had to beg for a sandwich? As Henry chewed slowly, Eleanor's gaze drifted to his hands. Her eyes fell on his wrist, and she noticed something that made her freeze. It was the watch. The old, worn leather band and the simple but elegant face of the watch, it was unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't look away. That watch. Could it be? Eleanor's mind raced, memories flooding back, memories she had long tried to bury. The watch looked exactly like the one she had given years ago, to someone she had loved more than anything. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but tinged with emotion. "Excuse me, sir. May I see your watch?" Henry blinked, confused at first, but then glanced down at his wrist. He had worn that watch for so long it had become a part of him, something he rarely even noticed anymore. "Oh, this?" he said, gently unfastening the worn leather strap. It's an old keepsake. A gift from someone important to me." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she took the watch from him. The cold metal against her skin sent a shiver down her spine. Her fingers traced the edges, and as she turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. There, engraved on the back in small, delicate letters, was a name that made her chest tighten: Michael. It was the same watch. The one she had given to Michael, the man she had loved and lost. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought to keep her composure. This watch," she began, her voice faltering. Where did you get it?" Henry looked at her, surprised by her sudden change in tone. He didn't fully understand why she was so affected, but he answered softly. "It was my son's. Michael. He passed away many years ago. This watch was all I had left of him." Eleanor's world seemed to shift. Her heart pounded in her chest as the memories came rushing back, the laughter, the plans they had made, the love they had shared. Michael. Her Michael. "I loved him," she whispered, barely audible, as if speaking more to herself than to Henry. "I loved him more than anything." Henry stared at her, his own eyes filling with a mix of surprise and pain. "You knew my son?" His voice cracked as the reality of the moment settled in. Eleanor nodded, tears now spilling down her cheeks. "He was everything to me." The weight of the moment hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Eleanor sat there, the watch clutched tightly in her hands as if letting go of it would mean losing him all over again. Henry watched her, still processing what she had said. How could this stranger, this woman who had so selflessly stepped in to help him, have known his son? Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The memories were overwhelming, flashes of Michael's smile, the way he used to laugh, the plans they had made together. She had buried those feelings for so long, but now, holding the watch, it all came rushing back with a force she wasn't prepared for. "I didn't know," Henry whispered, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with a quiet sadness. "I didn't know anyone knew him the way you seemed to." His hands, once trembling, now rested on the table, still as if frozen in time. The shock of the moment held him captive. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes glazed over with the weight of the past. "We were close," she said softly. The words seemed inadequate to describe what Michael had meant to her. Clothes didn't even begin to cover it. We had so many plans, so much hope. But everything changed so suddenly. Henry lowered his gaze, the pain of his own memories surfacing. Michael had been the light of his life, the one thing that had kept him going even in the darkest of times. But then, in one tragic moment, that light had been extinguished, leaving him and his wife shattered. "My wife, Catherine," Henry began, his voice cracking as he said her name. She blamed herself. She always said if she had done more, if she had been stricter with him, he wouldn't have gone down that path. Eleanor looked up, her expression softening even more. She had heard of Catherine. Michael had spoken about her, though always with a certain distance, as if he could never quite meet her expectations. She wanted him to live a life that wasn't his. Eleanor said quietly, her voice tinged with both empathy and regret. He tried so hard to make everyone happy, but in the end. Her words trailed off, and for a moment they both sat in silence, lost in the shared pain of their memories. The café seemed to fade away around them, the noise of the other patrons now nothing more than a distant hum. Catherine never forgave herself. Henry continued, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "She blamed me too, you know. Said I wasn't firm enough. But I just I just wanted him to be happy. And after he was gone, nothing was ever the same. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tightening with emotion. She could feel the weight of Henry's words, the years of guilt and grief that had been eating away at him. It wasn't your fault, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. None of it was. Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. It's hard to believe that, after all this time. You lose a child, and the world never looks the same again. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand gently resting on his. The connection between them was undeniable now. Two people, brought together by the love they had shared for the same man, the same loss that had shaped their lives in such different ways. We lost him in different ways, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. But we both lost him. Henry nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Tears began to spill down his weathered cheeks, and he didn't bother wiping them away. The pain of losing Michael had never fully left him, and now, sharing it with someone who had known him, who had loved him, made it feel both heavier and lighter at the same time. Catherine, she never got over it, Henry whispered. And neither did I. We drifted apart after Michael died. We couldn't bear to talk about him, and that silence, it tore us both apart. Eleanor's heart ached at his words. The weight of unsaid things, the unspoken grief, was something she understood all too well. I didn't know where he had gone, she admitted, her voice faltering. One day, he just disappeared. I never had the chance to say goodbye. Henry lowered his head, his voice barely audible as he replied, Neither did I. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, each lost in their own thoughts, their own grief. The watch in Eleanor's hand felt heavier than ever, a small object that now seemed to carry the weight of an entire lifetime. I can't believe this, Henry murmured, shaking his head slowly. You were the woman he loved, and I never knew. All these years, and I never knew. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand still resting gently on his. He never stopped loving you, she whispered. He always talked about you, how much he wanted to make you proud. Henry smiled sadly, the first hint of a smile since he had entered the café. I always wanted him to be happy. I just didn't know how to show him that. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. You did the best you could, she said softly. And he knew that. They sat there together, two strangers bound by a shared past, by a man they had both loved and lost. The pain they carried, though heavy, now seemed just a little lighter, as if sharing it had taken away some of its sharp edges. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the trees as Henry and Eleanor walked slowly toward the small park where Catherine sat, waiting. Henry's steps were slow, each one seeming to take more effort than the last. Eleanor could feel the tension in the air, her heart heavy with anticipation. She hadn't seen Catherine in years, hadn't even imagined this moment happening. But here they were, and the weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on her. They approached the park, a quiet space tucked between old, crumbling buildings. Catherine sat on a bench beneath the shade of an ancient oak, her frail figure hunched over as she stared into the distance. Her gray hair was tied back loosely, and her old, tattered coat clung to her shoulders. She looked nothing like the proud woman Eleanor remembered. This was a woman who had been crushed by life, by loss, by grief. Henry hesitated for a moment, glancing at Eleanor with uncertainty. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. Are you sure about this? He asked, his hands trembling slightly. Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. We need to do this, she said softly, though her own heart was racing. There was no turning back now. As they neared the bench, Catherine looked up, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She recognized Henry immediately, of course, but when her gaze shifted to Eleanor, her face hardened. The years had not softened her. If anything, the bitterness and pain had etched deeper lines into her face, making her appear even more distant, even more unreachable. Henry, Catherine said in a low, raspy voice, her eyes flickering toward Eleanor. Who is this? There was a sharp edge to her words, a defensiveness that spoke of years of hurt and blame. Henry swallowed hard, glancing at Eleanor before answering. "This is Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking slightly. She was important to Michael. The name Michael hung in the air between them like a stone, heavy and unmovable. Catherine stiffened, her eyes flashing with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. "Eleanor?" she repeated, her voice rising. You're the one who took him away from us." Eleanor felt the blow of those words like a physical strike. The accusation, the raw emotion behind them, cut deep. But she held her ground, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "I didn't take him away, Catherine," she said quietly. "I loved him." Catherine's hands clenched tightly around the small bag in her lap. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow, the kind of pain that had been festering for years. "You were the reason he left," she spat, her voice trembling. "He was never the same after he met you. He distanced himself from us, from his family, and then he was gone." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her throat, her heart aching with the weight of Catherine's words. She had known that Michael's relationship with his parents had been strained, but hearing it now, so raw and filled with accusation, made it feel even more real. "I didn't want to take him from you," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "But Michael was his own person. He made his own choices." Catherine shook her head, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. "You don't understand," she whispered harshly. "I lost everything when I lost him. My son, my life, everything." Henry, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, his voice low and filled with the weariness of years of guilt. "We both lost him, Catherine," he said gently. "But it wasn't anyone's fault. It was an accident, and we've both been blaming ourselves for too long." Catherine's eyes flashed with pain as she turned to look at Henry. "You've been blaming yourself?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "You should have been stricter with him. If you had, maybe he wouldn't have gone off and… Her voice broke, and for the first time in years, the tears finally fell. The years of holding on to grief, of blaming herself, of blaming Henry, all seemed to unravel in that moment. Eleanor watched, her heart aching for the woman before her, a woman who had been torn apart by loss and unable to find her way back. "I loved him too," Eleanor said softly, her voice breaking through the tension. "I loved him more than anything, and I lost him too. We all lost him, Catherine. But blaming each other, it won't bring him back. It won't help us heal." Catherine's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back her sobs, but the emotional walls she had built were crumbling. Henry reached out, gently taking her hand in his own tears finally spilling over. "We don't have to keep hurting like this," he whispered. "We've both carried this pain for so long. Maybe it's time to let it go." For the first time in years, Catherine didn't pull away from him. Her grip on his hand tightened, and her sobs grew quieter though the tears kept falling. Eleanor, watching this, felt her own tears slip down her cheeks. This wasn't just about losing Michael, it was about losing themselves in the process. And now, finally, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been broken for so long. After what felt like an eternity, Catherine finally looked up at Eleanor, her eyes red and swollen from crying. There was no more anger in her gaze, just exhaustion and sadness. "I don't know how to forgive," she whispered. "I don't know if I can." Eleanor nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not easy," she said. "But holding on to this pain, it's only hurting you. Michael wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want us to be trapped in the past." Catherine closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She had been trapped for so long, unable to move forward, unable to forgive herself, Henry, or Eleanor. But now, here they all were, three people bound together by love and loss, and for the first time, she felt the possibility of healing, of letting go. "I'll try," Catherine whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how, but I'll try." Eleanor smiled through her tears, a small but genuine smile. "That's all we can do," she said softly. "Just try." The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of renewal. Henry, Catherine, and Eleanor had been through a storm of emotions, but now, for the first time in years, there was a calmness between them. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. The process of healing had begun, and though the past could never be undone, they were learning how to live with it. They had all lost Michael in different ways, but now, they were united by more than just grief. They were connected by the love they had shared for him, and by the common desire to move forward, not away from him, but with his memory as a source of strength, rather than pain. On a crisp autumn morning, the three of them sat together in Eleanor's cozy living room. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth added warmth to the space. Catherine, who had once been so distant, now sat quietly beside Henry, her hands resting in her lap, but this time, her posture was more relaxed. The weight of years of bitterness and anger seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice gentle as she looked across the room at Henry and Catherine. "You've both been through so much. Maybe it's time we start thinking about what comes next." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes still carrying the exhaustion of years spent wandering through life without direction. "I don't even know what next looks like anymore," he admitted softly. His voice was tired, but there was a glimmer of hope in it, a hope that hadn't been there before. Catherine glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "We've been living, just surviving for so long," she murmured. "I don't know what it means to really live anymore." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe it starts with letting go of some of the pain," she suggested. "I know it's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But holding on to all this grief, it's only kept us stuck. What if we started building something new together?" Catherine looked down at her hands, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the worn fabric of her coat. The idea of starting over, of letting go of the pain that had defined her for so long, was terrifying. But there was also a part of her, buried deep beneath the layers of hurt, that longed for peace. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I want that," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I want to try." Eleanor smiled, a soft and encouraging smile that carried the promise of hope. "That's all we can do," she said gently. "We try. One day at a time." Henry's voice broke the silence, his tone filled with a mixture of relief and vulnerability. "I never thought I'd have a chance like this again," he said. "After we lost everything. I didn't think there'd be any way back." Eleanor shook her head. "There's always a way back, Henry. It's never too late to find peace. Michael would want that for you, for both of you." At the mention of Michael's name, the room fell into a brief, contemplative silence. His presence, though absent in body, was felt deeply by all of them. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of quiet acceptance rather than anger or regret. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think he would want us to be okay." Eleanor nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "He loved you both so much," she said, her voice tender. "And that love doesn't disappear, even when someone is gone. It's still here, with us. And I think that's something we can carry with us into whatever comes next." The following week, Eleanor helped Henry and Catherine settle into a small apartment not far from her own home. It was modest, but warm and welcoming, a place where they could finally rest. The move felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. As they unpacked their few belongings, Eleanor stood by, offering her help and her company. Henry placed the small box that contained Michael's watch on the kitchen table, his hands lingering over it for a moment before letting it go. It was a symbol of the past, but now, it would serve as a reminder not of loss, but of the love that had bound them together. Catherine, meanwhile, carefully arranged their new space. There was something cathartic about it, about creating a home again after so many years of feeling homeless, both physically and emotionally. She glanced at Henry, who gave her a tired but genuine smile. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they weren't simply surviving. They were living. That evening, as they sat together around the small dinner table, Henry, Catherine, and Eleanor shared a quiet meal. The conversation was light, filled with small but meaningful moments, like the way Henry laughed softly at one of Eleanor's stories, or the way Catherine smiled faintly as she sipped her tea. There was no need for heavy words. The silence between them was comfortable, peaceful. Later, as Eleanor prepared to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to look at them one last time. "You know, this isn't the end," she said with a smile. "It's just the beginning." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet determination. "We know," he said. "And this time, we'll make the most of it." As Eleanor walked out into the cool evening air, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey they had all been on, filled with loss, pain, and regret, wasn't over. But now, it felt like there was finally room for something new, something hopeful. She glanced back at the small apartment one last time, her heart full. For Henry and Catherine, this was more than just a place to live. It was a chance to heal, to move forward, and to build a life that Michael would have wanted for them. It was a chance to start again. The sun poured gently through the windows of Henry and Catherine's small, cozy apartment. It had been several months since they had moved in, and slowly but surely, their lives were starting to feel like their own again. The weight of the past still lingered, but now it felt lighter, more bearable. Each morning, Henry would sit by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world outside. His hands, once trembling with age and fear, now held the cup steady, a quiet symbol of the strength he had regained. Catherine, who had once been consumed by grief, now tended to the small garden she had started on the balcony. There was something peaceful about the act of nurturing life, something that gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The days passed quietly, filled with simple routines and small joys. They no longer carried the weight of merely surviving. Instead, they were beginning to build something new, a life filled with peace and quiet contentment. Though the scars of the past remained, they were no longer defined by them. And Eleanor's presence in their lives made sure they never felt alone in their journey forward. Eleanor's visits had become a regular part of Henry and Catherine's lives. Every week, she would stop by with fresh groceries or a new book for Henry, her heart always full as she watched the quiet transformation taking place. The bond between them had deepened over time, not just out of shared loss, but from the new memories they were creating together. Each visit felt like a step closer to becoming a family, something none of them had expected, but something all of them had needed. The conversations they shared were no longer weighed down by the pain of the past. Instead, they talked about the future, about the little things that brought them joy. Henry loved to tell stories about his time as a young man, laughing as he recalled old friends and adventures. Catherine, too, began to open up, sharing memories of Michael, not with sorrow, but with a soft smile that spoke of acceptance. Over time, they had learned to weave their shared memories of Michael into their present lives, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the love that had connected them all. Eleanor would listen intently, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. She could see how much they had changed, how much they had healed, and it filled her with a sense of purpose. They were not just surviving, they were living again together. These visits weren't just about reminiscing, though. They were about building new memories, creating a future where loss was no longer the defining factor in their lives. Eleanor's presence, once that of an outsider offering help, had become something much more. She was part of their family now, and in many ways, they were part of hers. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow across the small apartment where Henry, Catherine, and Eleanor sat together, sharing the quiet moments that had become so precious to them. The atmosphere was warm and peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after years of turmoil have finally settled. As the light faded, so too did the weight of the past, leaving behind something new, something filled with hope. Henry leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face as he glanced at Catherine, who was now happily knitting a new scarf by the window. There was a sense of contentment in her expression that he hadn't seen in years. Her grief, once so overwhelming, had softened. It was still there, a part of her, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a way to carry it without letting it define her life. Eleanor, sitting nearby, watched the scene unfold with quiet joy. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had stepped in to help in the first place. She had once been lost in her own grief for Michael, but now, seeing the way Henry and Catherine had begun to heal, she realized that she too had found healing through them. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were a family. As the evening grew darker, the conversation turned to the future. Henry spoke softly about his plans to take a short trip with Catherine, perhaps to visit an old friend they hadn't seen in years. It was a small step, but for Henry and Catherine, it represented something much larger, a willingness to embrace life again, to move forward despite the pain they had carried for so long. "We've been through a lot," Henry said, his voice steady and reflective. "But I think we're finally starting to find peace." Catherine nodded in agreement, her knitting needles clicking softly in the background. "It's been a long journey," she whispered. "But I think we're ready to move on." Eleanor smiled at their words. There was something incredibly powerful about watching people heal, about seeing the way love and forgiveness could transform even the deepest wounds. "You've both come so far," she said softly. "And I know Michael would be proud of you." The mention of Michael's name brought a brief silence to the room. His presence was always there with them, in the unspoken spaces between words, in the quiet moments of reflection. But now, his memory didn't bring the sharp sting of pain that it once had. Instead, it brought a sense of connection, a reminder of the love they all shared for him. "He's with us," Henry said quietly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "In everything we do, in the way we live our lives now, he's still here." Catherine smiled, her eyes glistening with tears, but they were tears of peace, not of sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "He's with us." The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that, memories of Michael that brought laughter rather than tears, stories of their past lives, and the joy they found in their new routines. They talked about the garden Catherine had started, about the books Henry had begun to read again, and about the small but meaningful ways their lives had changed since Eleanor had stepped into them. Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest as she listened. This was what Michael would have wanted, for them to live, to find happiness again, even after everything they had lost. And as she sat there with them, she realized that she too had been changed by this journey. She had found her own peace, her own path to forgiveness, not just for others, but for herself. As the evening wore on, the conversation slowed, and the quiet settled back into the room. Eleanor rose from her chair, ready to leave for the night, but before she did, she turned to Henry and Catherine with a soft smile. "You know," she said gently, "we've all come such a long way. And I think that's the most important thing. We've learned to forgive, to let go of the past. But more than that, we've learned to live again." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting the deep truth of her words. "Yes," he said quietly. "We've learned to live." Catherine stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm as she looked at Eleanor with a heartfelt smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Eleanor shook her head. "You did this yourselves," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "I just gave you the chance. The rest, you found that within yourselves." As she walked toward the door, the weight of the journey they had all taken together hung in the air, but it was a lightness now, not a burden. They had come to the end of one chapter, but the future stretched out before them, bright and full of possibility. "Good night," Eleanor said softly as she stepped out into the cool night air. She paused for a moment, looking up at the stars twinkling above. The night felt full of promise. The past no longer felt like something to run from, but rather something they could carry forward, gently, with love. In the face of loss, it is love, forgiveness, and connection that help us heal. Together, we can move forward, not in spite of the past, but because of it. It is through these bonds that we find peace, and the courage to embrace the future.